Welcome everyone to the Effective Managers webinar, The Blueprint to Effective Managers. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to this session. First, just a bit about myself. I've been a manager, an executive. I've run organizations. I've been a management consultant in organization design. But for the last 5 years, I've been really focusing in on manager effectiveness, trying to understand what it is that gets in the way of managers being as effective as they can be in organizations. It's kind of ironic. It's typically the middle managers that are in the middle. They're the ones that are kind of the grist for the mill, trying to get things done, often in spite of overwhelming odds. So, in response to that, the research that I've done, the reading that I've done, we've created effective managers to really focus in on that area and to help organizations ensure that their managers can be working as effectively as they can. Today's webinar is actually quite an exciting one. When I put together the newsletter for January, I thought it would be a great idea if I found the most read articles, and these are the all-time 3 most read articles, and I did republish those and gave, because I've got a lot of new followers and people on the e-newsletter list that might not have had an opportunity to see these. And as I looked at them, I realized that there were some consistencies in terms of tying everything together. So the first one, which is the 3 factors that impact organizational effectiveness, is really about how effective is the organization and how can you make sure that the organization is effective as possible. But then the second one, which is successful managers versus effective managers, is really about managers being effective. And then the third one is why top performers often don't make the best managers. So if we think about it, the first one is about accountable organizations, the second one is about accountable individuals, and the third one is about capable individuals. So I thought, hey, if we take all of those together, that is a blueprint for organizational effectiveness. So that was what sparked this. And if your organization can be effective, then we'll have effective management, and that's why where we're going with this. Just before I dive into the 3 specific areas, I think the question we should ask ourselves is why does it matter? So what is it that matters about managers being more effective and organizations overall being more effective? And I think the best way to think about that is to think about the strategy of an organization. So if organizations develop a strategy, they spend a lot of time and effort in terms of developing that vision for the perfect organization that they see, 5 or 10 years out, whatever the time frame is for the strategic implementation. And then they put together all of the different goals and other aspects of work plans to be able to achieve there. But when the time frame comes up in the 3, 5, 10 years, whatever it might be, the result is often quite different than what was envisioned. And this is not because of any ill will of any individual or any group of individuals in the organization. It's because things just go off the tracks in terms of implementing the strategy. And research bears this out. If we think about organizations, this is a quote from Forbes magazine, Dr. Cotter, who's an excellent change management person and did a lot of research into strategy execution. And he found that 70% of organizations fail to achieve their strategic goals. He said only 5% of all organizations implement them effectively, and the other 25% are somewhere in the middle. So I've coined a phrase to cover this off, and I call it organizational churn. Now we can use churn in organizations to talk about turnover of individuals, turnover of people in positions, and that's part of it. But the other part of it, and I think the larger part, is that in organizations, things often get in the way of people doing their work, and that creates tension, it creates anxiety, it creates activity, which is not useful for the organization, not useful for the department, and not useful for the individual. So anyway, we'll be coming back to that in a few minutes. So the overview then is how do we create an organization that has a better chance of achieving its strategic goals? So the first one is the 3 factors that impact organizational effectiveness. Now this is this is not within the authority of all of you who are on this to change, because typically a lot of the things we're going to be talking about here happen at the board CEO level. But I think it's really important to understand the genesis of accountability in organizations. So if we think of the role of the board, that's where the authority starts. Now, whether an organization is a not-for-profit, or if it's a government agency, or if it's a privately held company, or if it's a solely owned company by an owner, there is an accountability framework, and I'd like to address those quite quickly, because if you're an owner-manager, it's pretty straightforward. You own the company, and you have the authority to make decisions that are going to impact the entire company. You might create an advisory board and would give you some advice, but that doesn't take away from your authority as an owner just to do what you need to do. But if you're a public company, then you have a board of directors, and in that case, it's the board that has the authority over the company. Similarly, with a not-for-profit board, it's the members of the organization that create that board. And if you're a government agency, it gets a bit more complex, but if you think about how the authority structure works there, it works up through the staff structure, through the deputy minister, to the minister, ultimately to cabinet. So it's the people of Canada are the members, if you will, that elect the government that runs those organizations. So if we map it out, and this is as deep as I'm going to be getting into this, but if we map it out, if we think about shareholders or members or whoever that group is that owns the organization, some other type of stakeholder perhaps, they come together to an annual meeting. And at that annual meeting, based on their representation, they elect a board of directors. And then that board is given the authority to run the company between meetings of the annual meeting. So the board creates policy, and the board might be an operating board. So very small organizations, the board of directors might do all of the work themselves. But for a larger organization, and certainly for a publicly held company, that board of directors has the authority on behalf of the stakeholders or the shareholders to run that organization. So as an organization gets larger, they can't do all the work themselves. They hire a general manager, an executive director, or a CEO, and the board delegates accountability and authority to the CEO to do the work that's necessary to operate that organization. So the board has the governance role, the CEO has the operational role, and therefore the accountability and authority flows down from the CEO, who appoints a staff operation and delegates accountability and authority down the organization. So if you think about it in that way, then the CEO really needs to have some kind of a framework in place for the delegation of work down the organization. Because if we don't have clarity of this accountability about what is my role and how does this relate to the overall strategy of the organization, in spite of the fact that the CEO has a very crisp vision of where the company is going to be going, as the work flows down the organization and is delegated down the organization, there tends to be drift. So the result is what we saw, a less than ideal result in terms of strategy implementation. So the goal then is to change that around so that everyone in the organization has exactly the same understanding of what their role is, how they work together, how they are accountable, and what authority they have with respect to doing the work that is necessary for their department, so that the organization overall is pulling in exactly the same direction. So that those are the first 2 points that we covered off in this article. It's the fact, the essence of it is that the board carries the accountability and authority for the organization. The CEO therefore is delegated accountability and authority and has to make sure that people in the organization understand what their role is and how they work together. And then the third aspect is the clarity of the managers themselves. So if they are clear, then we can try to remove this, as we see in this slide, the burden of managing and make them make a situation where they can focus in on the important stuff. A couple of things about clarity for managers and organizations. The first is that in research that we did with the University of Ottawa, managers only spend 55% of their time doing value-added work. So value-added work is work that only you, in your role, with your capability and the resources that you have available, are able to do. So it's work basically that you in your position can do to add the value to the organization that comes with the salary that you're being paid to do that work. So if managers aren't able to focus on their value-added work, what does that mean? That means that there are three things that are potentially at risk. One is that their day-to-day work and continuous improvement, are they able to focus in on that? And the answer to that is typically yes. I mean, if you're not doing your day-to-day work, flags will go up pretty quickly in an organization. The second is projects or change initiatives. A manager may be appointed to a particular project, and that will tend to be time bound, so those tend to get the attention. The third one is managerial leadership. If you think about it, only managers, the manager in that role is the only one who has the accountability and the authority to do the managerial leadership role for the members of the team. So which one do you think is going to slip if a person can only spend 55% of their time on value-added work? And again, it's not through ill intent, but it's always the managerial leadership one, because you can delay that performance feedback meeting for a day or a week. You can postpone your staff meeting. You can not have your weekly sit-down meeting with your team members. So it's very easy. It's this thing about the important versus the urgent, right? The manager understands it's important work, but all this urgent stuff gets in the way. And if that's diluted with the fact that they can only spend 55% of their time on their value-added work, it just gets short shrift. I had an excellent question here, and I'm just going to answer it because it ties directly to the role of the CEO, and that is the difference between the strategy of the CEO and the strategy of the organization. And this is the one plan in the organization where the strategy and the plan are the same. So the organizational strategy, which is developed usually through some process, so the CEO doesn't sit down in the dark and do it. There's an upwards gathering of information, there's environmental scans, all of those things take place. There may be even a head of strategy that is doing a lot of the work for that, but it ends up being a strategic plan for the organization, which is approved by the board. That strategic plan then becomes the business plan, if you will, of the CEO, because the CEO will be held accountable to the board for achieving the deliverables that were promised in that strategic plan. So if the board approves it, they resource it, they're going to expect to see the results. So the CEO's strategy is the same as the strategic plan for the organization. At the next level down, at the VP level, the plan of the VP would be a subset of that strategy, and so on down the organization. Thank you for that question. The second bundle that we wanted to address is successful managers versus effective managers. And again, does it really matter? I draw extensively on this one from research by a man named Luthans and his colleagues that did a lot of research into successful managers. And he found that those, by defining success as people that rise rapidly in the organization, so you'd think people who are promoted and given higher level positions in the organization are successful, and I think that's a fairly good thumbnail description. But he was curious about, are those people effective? And you define effective as those who have satisfied employees, committed employees, and they have really high quality and high outcome work in their organizational units. And I think that's an important distinction, because what he found is those managers who are successful are not necessarily those managers who are effective. And what we found is, or what he found, I'm sorry, is that successful managers tend to be those ones that are very, very good at social networking skills, kind of the managing upwards or the politicking and interacting with outsiders, while the effective managers, those that are getting the job done and really delivering the results, tend to be doing better communicating and doing better on human resource management activities. Those are his words. I would use that to describe this as managerial leadership. So 4 out of the 5 activities that relate to effective managers are indicative actually of unsuccessful managers, or those who are promoted slowly. So it's a really, really important point for us to bear in mind here, that as we're thinking about promotional opportunities in the organization, that we think about success and effectiveness. Now, I'm not saying that social networking skills and interacting with outsiders is bad. In fact, it's very, very good. So what we need to do is think about how do we set in place a framework in the organization so that those managers who are good at social networking, who are good at interacting with others, and who are delivering the kinds of results that are necessary for effectiveness in the organization are those that are being considered for promotion. So in that respect, there's it does come back to this whole part about managerial leadership and how do we do our work. So I wanted to quickly, I've got 2 more slides on research, and then we're going to move on to other things. But this one's really at the heart of the matter. This was published first in 1994 by James Heskett in Harvard Business Review. He's a professor at Harvard University, and he did a lot of research leading up to this paper, and it's commonly now called the service profit chain. And the research shows, and this has been replicated many times in many different organizations since then, the research shows that if you have more satisfied or higher committed or more engaged employees, then that will result in more satisfied customers. And if you have more satisfied customers, that will lead to increased profit. So the lifetime value of the customer will be increased. This has also been replicated in government and not-for-profit organizations, except in terms of customer satisfaction, you have to think about clients or patients or recipients, and revenue and profit is more measured in outcome goals for organizational performance. So that is at the heart of this research, and it has been replicated in all of those areas. What's been lost over the years is this 4th fundamental part of the chain, and that is that managerial leadership underpins employee satisfaction in organizations. So it's the way in which managers do their work to ensure that employees are engaged, that they're being delegated work appropriately, that they have the right resources, that they're getting the feedback, all of these things that managers have to do that drives that employee satisfaction in organizations. Employee satisfaction isn't driven by wages or by nice premises or by a foosball table in the cafeteria. It's driven by giving people meaningful work where they're able to use their full capability and experience results that are meaningful and helpful to themselves, their team, and the organization. And that can only be driven through the manager's role in terms of managing their team members. The next point I wanted to make is around accountability, because I've been talking a lot about accountability today, and it is at the heart of each of the things that we're talking about. And we've been talking about effectiveness. So I wanted to show you that there is this very, very high correlation in organizations. This is the Effective Managers benchmark from 2016, the last time we compiled the benchmark. It's based on the survey that we do with organizations, based on the research with the Telfer School of Management at the University of Ottawa. And what we find overall in organizations is that organizations that have a higher rate of accountability have higher rates of effectiveness. And that correlation is 0.67 and highly significant. In social sciences, to get that high a correlation is actually surprising. We presented this paper to a research forum in Paris with Professor Swigo and I this past June, and they were surprised at this, but as we walked through the research, they understood that this is in fact a real correlation in terms of accountability and effectiveness. A correlation of 1, for those of you that aren't steeped in statistics, a correlation of 1 is a perfect correlation. It's kind of like wheels on a car going down a straight road. The wheels are completely correlated. They both turn at exactly the same rate. A correlation of 0 means no significance. It's random. So 0.67 means that accountability is important. The second aspect of accountability that's important is to think about what is the definition of accountability. And as I did the 2 years of reading and research leading up to the founding of Effective Managers, I was very surprised that there's only a handful of researchers looking into the area of accountability, and each of them have their own definition, unfortunately, of accountability. So there's no standard definition of accountability in management, in sort of management sciences, if you will. Imagine if you're an engineer and you had no standards in terms of building a building, or even a chef chef and trying to replicate a recipe without standards around measurement and weight and so on. So if we want to be successful in improving organizations, we also need to be successful in talking about these things in ways that are consistent within the organization. So Sui-Go and I came up with this definition, and this is the one that we've used, and it's weathered itself very, very well in the with the organizations where I do work implementing accountability frameworks. So accountability is an obligation for which one can be held to account for one's results and one's actions by a specified other. So it's an obligation. That's the first point. The second point is that it includes one's results and one's actions. So performing results at any cost is not appropriate. And that's true whether you're thinking about an organizational accountability or an individual accountability. So organizations have gotten into trouble in spite of being very, very successful in profit through environmental damage or doing other things that are not appropriate in the community. They can be called to task. Similarly with individuals, they might meet their annual objectives, but if they've left broken, bruised, and injured bodies behind in terms of breaking relations or undermining colleagues, then that has to be taken into account. And the third comment is the specified other. So one cannot, in this definition, one cannot hold oneself accountable. I can be responsible, and that's a good thing, so I can feel responsible for doing something because of my value set, but the accountability comes to me because it's delegated to me by my manager, and it's my manager that can hold me to account for the results. So when we think about accountability, there's a really, if you have one takeaway today, this is the takeaway. In accountability, there are two different dimensions, and this was the real breakthrough that we had in our research. The first one is what we call felt accountability. How strongly do I feel accountable for doing good work? And the response from managers is very high, a mean of 8.93. We asked the questions on a 10-point scale, so that means on average people are answering 9, so it's kind of between 8 and 10, if you will, in terms of people feeling accountable for doing good work. And that fits my model of and my experiences of working with people in organizations that they want to do well, they want the organization to do well, and they want their teams to do well, so that's very good. So that bears the question then, if people feel so strongly accountable, what am I going on and on about having to improve accountability in organizations? And that was a big question I had. And in fact, it's this second dimension, which is called clarity of accountability. So how clearly do I understand what I am being held to account for by that specified other, by my manager? So how clear am I about my accountabilities and my authority in this organization? And the mean there is 6.99. In other words, it's a C+, almost two full deciles apart in terms of understanding. So if I'm writing if I'm writing a term paper at university, I might be okay with a C+. But if this is an organization and we're talking about real people doing real work and using real resources, is a C+ in terms of being clear about what they're accountable for appropriate? Of course not, and that's what drives the churn in the organization, and that's what drives this drift in the organization in terms of not being able to meet the strategy. So the question we have, and this is part of that takeaway point, it's whether or not we have clear accountability in organizations, people are going to take on or feel accountable. So the question isn't whether or not managers are going to feel accountable, the question is whether managers will feel accountable for doing the right things. And that's the role of the manager. So if the manager, him or herself, isn't clear about what they're accountable, how can they pass that down to the next level? Or if the manager is spending 45% of their time on stuff that's not related to their work, how are they going to give the focus that they need to ensure that this accountability is delegated appropriately and clearly down throughout the organization? And remember, if that chain is broken anywhere between the CEO and the front line, then this clarity is not going to exist. The last point on this one, before we move on to the next section, is that clarity of accountability drives two things, and we will be circling back in a different way to this, but bear it in mind. One is it does drive this clarity of action, which we've been talking about up until now, but it also drives this clarity of interaction. So if I'm clear with my subordinates all the way down the organization, and my peer vice president is clear with her subordinates all the way down the organization, then there's a much greater chance that our subordinates at the front line are going to understand how they work together. If we aren't clear and if we're not consistent in that, then there will be conflict in the organization in terms of people not understanding how they relate to each other and the work that they need to do. Okay, we're doing great. We're now moving on to the third area, which is top performers don't always make the best managers. This comes down to a concept which is matching the requirements of the position to the capabilities of the individual. This is often thought of as the Peter Principle, and in fact on my YouTube channel I have a webinar about the Peter Principle if you want to dig deeper into this stuff, where people are promoted to their level of incompetence. And when I'm finished this section in the next about 8 or 10 minutes, you'll see why that happens in organizations. And in any organization of any size, think about it, there's someone there in a managerial position or a director position where they're not able to do their job capably within the organization. So the starting point, I've got an article on the website, they call it Discovering the X Factor, is that matching requirements to capabilities is important, and there are 3 fundamental capabilities that apply. So on the one side we have job requirements, which we have to be aware of. On the other side we have the capabilities of the individuals which are being matched into positions, which is important. So there are 3 of them, and they're generally not well understood in organizations, particularly this first one, which is problem-solving capability. So problem-solving capability is about how I, as an individual, go about solving problems. Elliot Jacks, who first discovered this and has done research and written 60 books of this over the last 50 or 60 years, he's passed away now unfortunately, calls it mental processing capability. So how do we use our minds to process information so that we can make decisions? And that varies in organizations and in individuals. So the requirements vary in organizations and the capabilities vary in individuals. The second one is skills and knowledge. So what are the skills that I need to be able to do that work, and what is the knowledge that I need to be able to do that work successfully? This also includes things like social processing skills, which are often not thought about. And here I'm not talking about competencies, which are sometimes helpful, but sometimes overused and misused. I'm talking about very concrete things like skills and knowledge as opposed to competencies and experience. And then the third one is application. How do I apply myself? And this is whether I value the work sufficiently that I'm going to apply myself. Okay, that's a quick overview. We're just going to dive into these ones quickly for a couple of minutes. So the first concept here around problem-solving capability is that the complexity of work varies in organizations by the level in the organization. So the higher in the organization generally that you go, the more complex the work is, and the higher order of problem-solving capability that will be required. So before your eyes start to glaze over, let me give you an example. So if I'm a frontline manager, and I've just been promoted into the job. My job is to understand the work of the front line, know all of my people, and to coach them and to improve them. It's to develop procedures and monitor procedures and oversee procedures. So that work usually, would have a timeline that I need to follow in order to be successful. Maybe some project-based stuff of 3 or 6 or 9 months. So I've got a relatively short cycle. So if I'm asked to diagnose a problem with a procedure and come up with a solution for that might take 6 months. So it's relatively complex work, but it can be managed within that time frame. But if I'm the vice president and I've been asked by the CEO to open a new market in Europe because we're saturated in North America, that might take 3, 4, maybe even 5 years to do the research, to understand the supply chain, to understand the markets, to get everything in place, and then to either start building facilities, renting facilities, outsourcing, whatever, all of those decisions. So there are many different balls in the air, some of which have to be done before you can move on to the next one. A lot of which can be delegated, but it needs to be overseen by the vice president. So we wouldn't say in most organizations that you can take a brand new frontline manager and expect them to be successful in the vice president role, simply because that complexity of work does change as you go up the organization. That can be measured, it can be assessed, there's a scientific way of doing that, and understanding that can help you to create an organization design where roles of similar complexity are aligned across the organization so that work will flow better. So capability to do the work then is dependent on the complexity of the work for the role in which you're placed, because if the complexity of work is different, then the problem-solving capability to do the work is different. The frontline manager needs a diagnostic capability to understand and to do the work that's necessary in that role. The vice president would need a parallel processing capability to get all of these balls in the air and manage them over time in parallel processes, moving resources back and forth across them. So for a successful placement, the candidate's problem-solving capability must be matched to the requirements of the complexity of work. And this is what happens when you, for the Peter Principle, if you take your absolute best candidate. Imagine in the front line. So you've got a bunch of workers, and one of them is an extremely good worker doing really good work, and you've got a vacancy for the frontline manager. Or imagine in your sales team, you've got the best salesman is out there just selling like crazy and doing really good, and you've got the sales manager position is vacant. The tendency, organizations are almost driven to promote that person into the managerial role. But if they don't have that next level of problem-solving capability, which is a diagnostic instead of a cumulative, then they're not going to be successful because they won't be able to add value to their teammates. And how many of you have seen people promoted into those positions and they're just not successful at it because their former peers don't recognize them as the boss? The person tends to be on the floor or out in the field doing the job that they previously had instead of doing the managerial job. It's because they don't have that level of problem-solving capability that's required. So the takeaway from this one is that as there's increasing complexity of work, there's requirement for increasing problem-solving capability of managers with the right skills and knowledge, and that will apply themselves to their work. There's one key point here, and it was on the previous slide. I kind of skipped over it, but I'll just stress it here. Those of you that have the slides in front of you, look at the bottom of slide 32, and that is that problem-solving capability cannot be trained. It's a maturation process. It's a maturation of a person's brain in much the way that we mature to be a certain height or mature to have a certain hair color or eye color. These are things that are biological and that people develop over time. So it's important to bear in mind that we can't take that frontline worker or that salesperson, and as we put them into the management position, train them to be able to do that diagnostic work. They need to be able to manage. Yes, you can give them sales manager training, or you can give them frontline manager training, and that will give them the skills and knowledge, and that could be helpful, but it won't give them the problem-solving capability that they need. So skills and knowledge, just quickly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these ones, but just to give you some insights. So skills and knowledge is the second category. The tools that are typically used are things like experience, education, competencies, and that's a good start, but they're not sufficient to identify the requirements for the role. So I refer you to these people, McDonald, Burke, and Stewart. Excellent book where they talk about technical skills, knowledge, and social processing skills. So these do include things as you see on this slide, and also the managerial leadership requirements to be able to do that work. So by identifying these, what you're doing is really getting to the heart of the skill set of the individual. So 5 years of experience doesn't really tell you whether that person has that knowledge or whether they have the technical skills or the social processing skills. They might have been in a dead-end job and they've just been doing the same thing year after year after year. So it becomes really important to verify that. So skills and knowledge gaps can be trained. So if you have somebody that you need to hire into a position and they don't have the skills and knowledge, but they do have the problem-solving capability, then you can give them the training that they need to be able to do that work. And the third area is application, and this is a new concept for many individuals, where we're really talking about whether the person is going to expend the effort that they need for success in the job. So again, think about the person that's been appointed to the manager position. If they applied for it simply because they want to be a manager, but not because they really value doing managerial work, they're not going to do the important work of managing, or it's going to be always at the bottom of the pile in terms of priorities. So they're not going to be giving the feedback sessions, they're not going to be doing the performance management reviews on time, they're not going to be doing the paperwork, whatever, they're not going to be having the meetings and so on. So making sure that people actually value the work that you're hiring them into becomes really, really important. So recap quick then, problem-solving capability is a yes or no for the level of work. Skills and knowledge can be trained, and application, it depends. You know, people may not value the work because they don't have the skills they need, so they avoid doing that work. So by giving them the skills and the training to do that, they may learn to value it, or they may be coached into it. You know, you're a manager now, these are things that you need to do, buck up and do your work. But sometimes people don't respond. So if they don't, then they may not be suitable for that job. So if somebody really doesn't value being a manager and they're in a managerial role and you can't coach or train them out of it, then they're just not in a suitable role. So what do we do about it? So how do we implement accountability and authority frameworks in organizations? So I just wanted to give you an introduction to that. So the first thing that we really do need to do is understand the current state. There's a lot of work that has been done recently in well, not recently, over the last couple of decades in employee engagement. And that's really important work, because we see that organizations with a higher percentage of engaged employees are more effective organizations and more successful. The problem is that over 20 years that this measurement has been going on, the ratios in terms of engaged employees versus not engaged employees hasn't changed. It's still running around 30% in North America, and that's because we're tending to focus in on the symptoms in organizations of employee engagement. You know, sort of the things I talked about earlier, as opposed to the driving factors of managerial leadership practices and skills. And up until now, there hasn't been a way to measure that. So that's one of the reasons that I got motivated to come out of semi-retirement to launch Effective Managers, is that organizations did not have a way of managing the state of their managerial workforce. So the manager effective assessment does exactly that. It identifies the percentage of time that managers spend on their value-added work in a couple of different ways. It looks at other factors that are related, and specifically it looks at effectiveness, felt accountability, and clarity of accountability, and then what the drivers are behind that, and how organizations can go about creating a dynamic in the organization where they are more effective. So unless you understand what the current state is, it's really hard to understand where to impact, to make changes that are going to drive your organization to the level of performance that you would like. Again, I've got other webinars on this, so I won't dive into this more. If you want more information, I also have a white paper on that. I'd be very happy to send it to you. So the next step then is to do something about it. Once you understand the current state, effectiveness in your organization isn't where you want it to be. What are the things that you can do to help that out? Well, we've developed something called the effective point of accountability. We're very pleased that we were able to obtain the registered trademark for that, and use it with organizations very successfully to provide that framework. So it's a way of working together differently so that we can do our work consistently, and people have a language to discuss how we delegate work down the organization, but also how we collaborate across the organization. So part of the effective point of accountability is thinking about how work is delegated. So in an organization, what you want to do is chunk work up. So that vice president example I gave you about opening a new market in Europe, the VP isn't going to be able to do all of that work on his or her own. So they'll be going to somebody in operations to be doing some research into the supply chain. They'll be going to finance in terms of financing options. They'll be going to HR in terms of what the workforce is like, and so on. So each one of these things is actually taking the work and chunking it down, moving it down to the next level. Then the head of HR is going to be asking managers and directors to be doing parts of it, and so on. So the trick in delegating work down the organization is to find that single point of accountability as low as possible in the organization where the person has the capability to successfully do the work. So one risk is you delegate it too far down the organization, the person doesn't have the capability and they'll fail. The other risk is that you keep it too high in the organization and you're paying more than you need to get the work done because you're paying the higher level of compensation for that value-added work. The second part of the effective point of accountability is thinking about cross-functional work. And this one gets much, much more complicated because if you think about cross-functional work, and again, I've got a webinar on this one. If you think about cross-functional work, if I'm on this team green in the lower left part here, and I've got a disagreement about how we work together over there and on the right in the dark blue. I always pick on finance and operations because every organization I go into there's a problem. So finance requires some reports, operations has to provide the reports, finance feels it's operations accountability to pull the reports together, operations feels it's finance's work and it's not really their job. So every time the person in finance goes to operations and says I need this report filled out, the person in operations says, well, I'll try to get to it, but I've got real work to do. So it's like they feel they're doing the person in finance a favor to get this work done. Similarly in HR and the HR hiring guidelines, there's always conflict between implementing the guidelines around the starting salaries and so on based on the experience of the person. So what has to happen is if those two people disagree, who's the person that can decide who's right or what is the better way of doing it? I guess right or wrong isn't as important as which is the best way for the organization to do that work. If I'm in blue, my manager on team blue can't resolve the problem because the manager on team blue can't influence the person on team green, and vice versa. Even if we move up to the vice president level, the vice president gray and vice president dark green can talk about it, and if they can resolve it and agree, then that's great. Then they can direct further down the organization how to work differently. But if they can't agree, it comes to the CEO to be able to make that decision. So for most organizational processes, and especially and exactly for the organization-wide processes, the CEO is the effective point of accountability. So the accountability framework and authority framework then creates that foundation or that method or that language for how we manage here and how we collaborate here. So it's like creating the rules of the road. Imagine driving down the road and there's no rules of the road. It would be gridlock, you know, if people didn't know what signal lights were or traffic lights were, and we didn't even know which side of the road we were supposed to be driving on. It would be just a nightmare. The same thing is absolutely true in organizations. If we don't have a common language to talk about how we work together, and if we're not delegated accountability and authority in a consistent way so we understand how we work with each other in the organization, then we're going to make it up as we go along, and we'll be trying to figure it out, and that's going to result in a big chunk of that 45% of the churn that we've identified, where people are spending their time negotiating, arguing, disagreeing, instead of simply getting down and doing the work and moving it along. In terms of the cross-functional work, what we've done is worked with the framework from Elliot Jacks, who wrote Requisite Organization, and outlined a very, very solid and comprehensive framework for cross-functional accountability and authority, but also quite difficult to implement in organizations because of its complexity, although it's very, very robust. And Jerry Cranes, who wrote a book called Accountability Leadership, and he took a very good crack at simplifying Elliot's structure. So I've taken both of those, and based on my experience in implementing Elliot's work in large complex organizations, we've come up with a cross-functional framework which actually has 3 basic relationships. So if I'm in one part of the organization, let's use that finance and operations example, I can either be in an informing relationship, I can be in a persuading relationship, or I can be in an instructing relationship. So in cross-functional work, we absolutely don't want to undermine the authority of the manager, but we also have to define how it is that we will work together. Each one of those 3 each also has a subset. So where I find the biggest conflict in organizations is when, for example, one individual thinks that they're instructing the other person on what they need to do, and the person that's receiving the instruction believes that they're receiving advice, which they can decide whether they're going to use it or not. So immediately that sets up that misunderstanding. So the takeaway from this section is that for cross-functional work, the effective point of accountability rests with the position that can decide and direct. So if you're ever trying to solve a problem in a process, and you can't, or if you're trying to figure out a problem in terms of how work flows in other ways across the organization and you can't agree, the trick is to look up the organization where you find that one single role, who is a single point of accountability, that can decide what the resolution is going to be and can direct people to work differently. It doesn't have to be the full-time job of that individual, or the CEO would be doing nothing but resolving issues, because at each step as you move up the organization, people can discuss and agree and do things differently through negotiation. But my point is that when that doesn't work, or it gets overly burdensome, or they can't agree, you have to find that person that can make the decision. And the last slide in this section that I wanted to give you is just to show you how one can go about implementing a cross-functional accountability, well, the effective point of accountability, or indeed any framework. So it doesn't have to be mine, it could be another framework that would work in your situation. So the starting point should always be that you're starting with the CEO and the vice president, so the top 2 layers of the organizations. They should be working in a natural team, and they should be thinking about how they work together differently. So the CEO will be explaining how he or she is going to work differently based on the new strategy that's been approved by the board, but then setting absolutely clear context about what the impact is going to be for each of the vice presidents, what that means in terms of working differently today, tomorrow, and over the next year, what the outcomes are and what they are, what the resourcing is going to be, and so on. Too often, once the strategy is approved, everybody heaves a sigh of relief and says, we've got our strategy, and the CEO says, okay, VP, is the way you go and implement it. And then again, this is the point where I make, through no ill will, the finance person has a sort of a different spin, the operations person has sort of a different spin, because they're a product of their role and their background and their understanding of it. So having those conversations individually in a group becomes really, really important. Once that's done, then each of the VPs need to move on and have similar meetings with their directors, so that the VP and the directors are collaborating and understanding. The VP is talking about the meeting that was just held with the CEO and how their job is different, what they're going to be doing differently, and what the impact is going to be on the division, and then talking with each of the directors about how that's going to change their work, what the expectations are, and so on. In other words, all of the factors of clarity, of accountability, and authority need to go in. I show a feedback loop because once the VP meets with the directors, the VP may become aware of some factors, resourcing, whatever that's going to impact on the decisions that were made at the CEO, and some things might have to be revisited. And then you move down to the next level where the directors meet with the managers and fill them in and have that same discussion. Also, as part of this, it's absolutely helpful to have some of the discussions around what are the areas of lack of clarity that are leading to role conflict in the organization. So it's partly delegating the work down, but it's partly getting absolute clarity about the cross-functional work and the relationships. So if we need this form in finance, the CFO understands the importance of the form, but the COO also understands the importance of the form and why it's important to operations and the organization overall, and so that the director in operations is told that this gathering of information isn't a favor to finance. In fact, this is real work and you have to make time available for it, and if you don't have the resources, let's talk about how we're going to do that. Now, if you have a complex organization or if you're implementing a completely new system, and this is where I as a management consultant throw in a way of being able to help you do this, is you can bring external consulting support at the top of the organization where you can have an objective facilitator, bring some of the issues to the table, perhaps interview individuals in advance to gather an understanding of what the key issues are, introduce the concept and the terminology and the methods and the resources, and facilitate that meeting. So it's still a meeting of the CEO and the VPs, but you've got this external facilitation that can help bring the methodology in and ensure that the hard discussion is taking place. At the next level down, the VPs, an internal team could take over the facilitation, and the consultant could use that level to provide training to an internal team. So the internal team then becomes trained in and knowledgeable about the methodology. They become the subject matter experts inside the organization, and they provide this facilitation support. What you get by having the facilitated support is you get consistency, because you've got this objective third party that's bringing the methodology and the training to the group, but also someone that is helping to make sure that the right discussions are taking place. It can be quite easy in a meeting when people are very, very busy to pay lip service to some really important agenda items. So I always find it helpful to have that kind of a process in place. And then at the next level down, the internal team has been trained so they're able to carry off and roll this out in the rest of the organization. So your blueprint to effective management. So there are 11 steps. Number one, the accountability starts with the board. So we need to bear that in mind. We don't create accountability individually. We don't have self-managed teams, because self-managed teams need to be accountable, and you need to have single points of accountability. The CEO must ensure an accountability and authority framework exists and is followed. That's the work of the CEO. If you're not the CEO, you can get a real uptick in your division or your department or your team by understanding these concepts and using them, but it won't be as powerful as if it's an organization-wide system. Managers must focus on their value-added work, and especially managerial leadership. The biggest failing from my experience as in all my salaried roles and as a management consultant is managers failing to do their managerial leadership work. So people are trying to figure out on their own, and if you're in middle management, how do you figure out on your own what your role is in implementing strategy? You have to look at the strategy and you have to kind of interpret what that is. And imagine the dozens of middle managers in even a mid-sized organization, each interpreting what they need to do. Of course, we're going to have drift in the organization. Fourth is understand success versus effectiveness and strive for both. So we want effective managers to be the successful managers. Number five, we need to ensure everyone is clear about their accountability and authority and their role in achieving the strategy. Number six, understand complexity of work and align our positions accordingly. So this is really organization design. If we understand the complexity of the roles and get them all aligned properly so that people with the same problem-solving capability are in the same layer of the organization, imagine how much more smoothly work will flow across the organization. Number 7 is identify role requirements, which are problem-solving capabilities, skills and knowledge and application. So every role in the organization, if you're a team manager, each one of your team members, you should have a position description for them. And by position description, I'm not necessarily talking about that 20-page thing that many of you have. I'm talking about a very simple document that documents the overall accountability of the role and some of the key accountabilities for deliverables. But then in terms of requirements, what is the problem-solving capability you require for this role? What are the skills and knowledge, and what's the application? 8, 9, and 10 are a summary of just a few slides ago in terms of we can train employees for skills and knowledge. We can coach employees for application. But we can only assess problem-solving capability as it matures. We can't train or develop people into problem-solving capability. If we see someone is maturing, so someone is in a manager position, and you see that they're starting to use some of the same language as a director. They're starting to, maybe even they're not the top performer because they're starting to challenge some of the decisions made of the director. They may well be maturing and using problem-solving capability at that next level. So then you can start developing them in terms of cross-training and maybe giving them different experiences or whatever, but bearing in mind that they will soon be ready for a director level position. Often the best performing person is the person that's using the appropriate problem-solving capability for that level of work and therefore is ideally suited to that role. So if you promote them, you're losing your best professional in that role and gaining your worst manager at the same time. And then the last one is critically important is we need to assign people to roles based on the match of all 3 of these dimensions of capability. So I do have a couple of questions here. If you have any questions, now would be a great time to plug them in. We've just got a few minutes left. I did want to just quickly let you know that I have got all kinds of resources. Part of my mandate with Effective Managers is to provide resources to managers so you on your own can improve things. So do check out effectivemanagers.com for resources. Also check out YouTube. I have over 40 recorded webinars there on many different subjects, and there's one 20-minute clip on leaders versus managers, which is fun. It's from a seminar I did with the alumni at the Telfer School of Management, the Executive Leadership Program. So that's check out that and the last thing is do follow me on Twitter for, I say daily here, but it's not always daily. And if you'd like my e-newsletter, it is free, and you can register at effectivemanagers.com. And last but not least, if we're not connected on LinkedIn, let's connect on LinkedIn. It's a great way to stay together. So we have a couple of minutes left, and I have 2 questions here. What's the main difference between accountability and responsibility when it applies to HR? Well, responsibility is a good thing. It's value-driven, and it's driven by the individual. So if I'm walking down the hallway and I see some litter on the floor, I'm not accountable for picking up that litter because we have a cleaning staff that's accountable for that. That's their job. But my value set may be that I appreciate a clean workplace, and I want my colleagues to enjoy a clean workplace. So I'll bend over, I'll pick up that litter, and I'll throw it in the trash. So another example might be I've got a colleague who's working on a PowerPoint, and they're miserable because they just can't get it to do something, and I really know PowerPoint really well. So I'm not accountable for helping somebody out with PowerPoint. There's a help desk to do that, but I feel a responsibility to help out a teammate because in 2 minutes I can help them with something that's taking them a long time to do. So that's responsibility. Accountability is driven through the system of the organization. So the accountability is delegated from a manager to a subordinate. So when it comes to HR, understanding the difference between those 2 things is really important, because someone who's highly responsible and carries the values of the organization is an asset to the organization, but we also have to be sure that the managers of those individuals are also doing their managerial leadership or to make sure that they're delegating accountability and authority appropriately. Social processing skills, can I describe those more visually? Yes, not in the time we have available, Peter, but I think it's an excellent question. So social processing skills have to do with how I interact with others. So there's 5 levels of them. The first one starts with self. So how do I react to social stimuli myself, and how do I deal with it? The next one deals with colleagues. So how do I deal with colleagues in a social way, and do I understand socializing with others and so on? So many individuals in an organization, particularly those that are highly introverted, might have social processing skills well developed itself, but don't really socially interact well with colleagues. So this is something important to understand in terms of the role and what the requirements of the role are. So then we have others, including external, and then finally the highest one is dealing with highly complex organizations and external factors. So which one would need for a CEO or perhaps a CFO in terms of being able to understand how we communicate throughout a part of the system or throughout a whole system, and react appropriately as well with the external environment. So what it does is creates a framework of steps of increasingly complex social interactions that are required. If you identify that what's required for the role, then when you're engaging or interviewing individuals, it gives you more clarity around what their social processing skills might need to be for success in that role. So that brings us right to the hour, and if there are any more questions that I haven't been able to answer, there's just a short 3-question survey at the end. Please feel free to drop any questions into there that you would like, and if you did take the 2 minutes to fill out that survey, I would really appreciate it. This is a bit of a different format because it's a little bit less practically oriented than many of my webinars, but I was just so excited to have this content and to share it with you, and I do thank you for your time. Thanks very much. Bye.
Hi, I'm Dwight Mahalitz, President of Effective Managers. Thank you so much for downloading the webinar. I hope that you enjoyed it and will find it useful. Feel free to check out other parts of the website for interesting downloads. Most are free, some are at a nominal charge, but I'm sure you'll find lots of interesting tools there and things that can help you be more effective. And in fact, that's what my job is. My job is to help you, help your organization be higher performing. The bottom line is that I want to start where you are, understand your problem, and provide services that can help you solve that problem and implement a solution as quickly and as effectively and as efficiently as possible. Give me a call, drop me an email. I'd love to hear from you, talk about your situation, and see if there's anything that we can do together. Thank you.